Welcome back to Ignite the Fire, where we dive into messages from Flame Community Church.
Yeah.
You know, we hear the Christmas story every year, but have you ever pictured yourself
All right.
right there with the shepherds?
Yeah.
Today,
Yeah.
we're going to explore just that,
Okay. Yeah.
using Dan's sermon, When God Calls,
Okay.
and focusing on Luke chapter 2.
Awesome.
Um,
It's easy to just skim over the shepherd's part in the Christmas story.
right.
But their experience offers some really powerful insights into how we respond
Yeah.
when God calls us.
So paint the scene for us.
Okay.
These guys are out in the fields just doing their jobs. It's probably the middle of the night.
Right.
And they're likely thinking about anything but the coming of the Messiah, right?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
an ordinary night just like any other.
Yeah.
But then, as Dan describes it, this incredible light appears.
Yeah.
An angel of the Lord, surrounded by the glory of God.
Wow.
Talk about an unexpected wake-up call.
I can't even imagine. It's not like they had streetlights back then.
Oh.
It must have been pitch black.
Yeah.
And suddenly, bam, an angel appears.
Right.
What did Dan say their initial reaction was?
Where he pointed out that the shepherd's first response was actually disbelief.
Really?
It's almost as if they couldn't process what they were seeing.
Wow.
They must have been thinking, did we really just see that?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If an angel suddenly popped up in front of me, I'd probably think I was dreaming
Yeah.
or something. It's like, how do you even begin to wrap your mind around that kind of experience?
And the angel's message is pretty mind-blowing, too.
Yeah.
He says, today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you.
Wow.
He is the Messiah, the Lord.
Okay.
Now, you might think, okay, great news, let's go.
Yeah.
But Dan points out something really interesting here.
Okay.
The angel doesn't command them to go find Jesus.
He doesn't.
No.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
What does he do then?
He gives them a sign. He says, this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger.
Okay.
But the decision to actually go and seek out this newborn king is left entirely up to the shepherds.
So they have a choice to make. That's pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like they were forced or coerced into following the angel's message.
Exactly. And their response is what makes their story so powerful.
Yeah.
They choose to go, and they go with haste. They leave their flocks and run towards Bethlehem, filled with excitement and a burning curiosity to see this baby who is the Messiah.
It makes you wonder, what would we do if we were in their place?
Yeah.
Would we drop everything and seek Jesus with that same urgency and fervor?
Right.
It's easy to say yes.
Yeah.
But in reality, there are always distractions and doubts and obligations.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And that's precisely the kind of question Dan wants us to wrestle with.
Yeah.
What would it take for us to truly prioritize seeking Jesus above everything else? What are the things in our lives that might be holding us back from responding to God's call with that same wholehearted enthusiasm?
Okay, so we have this scene with the shepherds, this incredible encounter with the angel, and their decision to go seek Jesus.
Right.
Where does Dan go from there?
He uses this story as a springboard to talk about what it means to truly listen and respond when God calls us.
Okay.
He breaks it down into 3 key takeaways.
I love it when there's a clear framework.
Yeah.
What's the first takeaway?
The first one is, when God calls, listen up.
Okay.
Now, this might seem pretty straightforward.
Right.
But Dan digs a little deeper.
Okay.
He makes a distinction between hearing and truly listening.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about our ears picking up sounds.
Right.
It's about paying attention, really absorbing what's being said, and being ready to act on it.
Exactly. And, you know, we live in a world that's full of noise and distractions. Our phones are constantly buzzing. There's information overload everywhere we turn.
Yeah.
And it's easy to miss that still small voice of God trying to get our attention.
It's like trying to have a conversation in a crowded room.
Yes.
You can hear voices, but it's hard to focus on any one message.
Exactly.
So how do we make sure we're really tuning in to God's voice and not getting lost in all the noise?
That's a great question. And I think that's where the example of Matthew the tax collector comes in.
Good.
Dan mentions how Matthew immediately dropped everything and followed Jesus when he was called.
Wow.
There wasn't any hesitation or second guessing. It was a clear yes.
That makes you think about the things we might be clinging to.
Right.
That prevent us from responding to God's call with that same level of immediacy.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to cultivate those quiet spaces in our lives.
Right.
Those times of stillness and reflection where we can truly listen. for God's voice.
So the first takeaway is, when God calls, listen up.
Yes.
What's the next one?
Well, Dan goes on to say that listening isn't enough.
Okay.
We have to be ready to take action, to saddle up, as he puts it.
I love that saddle up. It's like, okay, we've heard the message.
Yeah.
We've tuned in. Now it's time to get moving.
It really is a call to action. And to illustrate this idea of saddling up, Dan uses this great analogy.
Yeah.
He talks about how in the old Westerns, when the call to action came, the cowboys didn't waste time debating or overthinking.
Right.
They saddled their horses and rode out to meet the challenge.
I can picture that scene so clearly.
Yeah.
The dusk flying, the sense of urgency.
Right.
It really gets the heart pumping.
And Dan's point is that we need that same kind of decisive action when we hear God's call. He even points out that the shepherds weren't explicitly told to rush off to Bethlehem.
Right. That's true.
The angel just gave them the sign.
Yeah. It was their own excitement, their own sense of urgency that propelled them to action, which actually makes me think. Sometimes we wait for all the answers, all the details to be perfectly clear before we're willing to take a step.
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
We can get so caught up in analyzing and planning that we miss the opportunity to simply trust and obey.
Yeah.
And, Dan brings up another great example from the Bible to illustrate this.
Okay.
Remember the story of Ananias and Saul?
Oh, yes. That's a pretty dramatic story.
Yeah.
God tells Ananias to go find Saul, who at this point is still persecuting Christians.
Exactly. And can you imagine what must have been going through Ananias' mind?
I'd be a little nervous.
He's probably thinking, wait a minute, God. You want me to go find the guy who's been throwing Christians in jail?
Yeah.
Are you sure about this?
I'd be pretty hesitant, to say the least.
Yeah.
But what does Ananias do?
Despite his fear and doubts, he chooses to obey.
Wow.
He goes and finds Saul, and what happens? Saul's life is completely transformed.
That's amazing.
And he becomes the Apostle Paul, one of the most influential figures in the spread of Christianity.
That's so powerful.
It's an amazing example of how saying yes to God, even when it feels scary or doesn't make sense, can lead to extraordinary results.
It really underscores the message that sometimes the most incredible journeys begin with a simple step of obedience.
Right.
But it's not always easy, is it?
It's definitely not. There are always going to be those doubts, those fears that whisper, what if you're wrong? What if you fail? What if it doesn't work out the way you hoped?
So how do we overcome those doubts and fears?
Right.
How do we cultivate that courage to saddle up and move forward even when we're not sure what lies ahead?
I think it starts with recognizing that we're not alone in this journey.
Okay.
We have the Holy Spirit to guide us, to empower us, to give us the strength we need to step out in faith. And, that sense of community of fellowship that we talked about earlier, that plays a huge role, too.
It's like having a group of fellow travelers cheering us on, encouraging us when we stumble, and reminding us of the truth when we start to doubt.
Exactly. We need each other. And that actually leads perfectly into Dan's third takeaway, when God calls, speak up.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
This is the part where we move from the internal to the external. It's not just about listening and acting.
Right.
It's also about sharing what we've experienced. Right.
Absolutely. Dan emphasizes that the shepherds didn't keep their encounter with the angel a secret.
Okay.
They were so filled with joy and wonder that they couldn't help but tell everyone they met about the baby Jesus.
That's like they were bursting with the good news.
Yeah.
They had to share it.
And it's interesting that Dan contrasts the shepherds' enthusiasm with the story of Stephen, who was persecuted and ultimately martyred for his faith.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful comparison.
Yeah.
The shepherds were met with wonder and amazement, while Stephen faced opposition and hostility.
Exactly.
It highlights that sharing our faith isn't always easy or well received.
It definitely isn't. But Dan's point is that it's still essential. Okay. He reminds us that sometimes speaking up might require courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones.
And yet there's also a beauty and a power in it, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
Even in the face of opposition, that unwavering commitment to sharing the truth can have a profound impact.
Absolutely. It's like a seed being planted.
Okay.
We may not always see the fruit of our words or actions, but the potential for growth and transformation is always there.
So how do we apply this to our lives? How do we speak up in a way that is both authentic and effective?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that sharing our faith doesn't always have to look like preaching from a pulpit.
Right.
or engaging in theological debates.
Right. It's about letting our actions speak louder than our words.
Exactly. And, sometimes the most powerful testimonies come from sharing our own personal stories,
Yeah.
our own experiences of how God has worked in our lives.
Like the shepherds. They didn't have any fancy titles or theological degrees. They were just ordinary people sharing their extraordinary encounter with God.
And their story continues to inspire us today, reminding us that we too have a story to tell, a message to share.
Okay, so we've unpacked these 3 powerful takeaways from Dan's sermon.
Yeah.
Listen up, saddle up, and speak up. They really do provide a framework for living out our faith in a more intentional and impactful way.
Absolutely.
But I have to ask, what stood out to you the most?
For me, it's the emphasis on community, on fellowship.
Okay.
We're not meant to do this alone. We need each other to listen, to encourage, to challenge, and to support each other on this journey.
Right.
And I think that's something that Dan really drives home in this sermon.
I completely agree. And that reminder is especially powerful during this Christmas season.
Yeah.
When we celebrate the birth of Jesus, who came to bring us together, to reconcile us to God and to one another.
It really is a beautiful reminder of the heart of the Christmas message. God's love coming down to earth in the form of a baby to bring us hope, peace, and unity.
And it's really striking.
What's that?
That unity starts with a community of believers.
Right.
Just like those shepherds who went and told everyone about Jesus.
Yeah.
We're called to do the same. It's like Dan was saying, when God calls, speak up.
That's right. And I love how Dan connected the shepherds' enthusiasm for sharing their experience with that verse from 1 John chapter 1, verse 3.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about proclaiming what we have seen and heard, inviting others into that fellowship with God.
That verse really does capture the essence of what we've been talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just about listening to God's call for ourselves.
Right.
It's about sharing that call with others, inviting them to experience that same transformative power in their own lives.
And that sense of fellowship, of community, is so vital to our growth as believers. We're not meant to navigate this journey of faith in isolation. We need each other for support, encouragement, and accountability.
It's like having a group of spiritual cheerleaders.
Yes.
People who are there to celebrate our victories, help us up when we stumble, and remind us of God's truth when we start to doubt.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes the shepherd's story so relatable and inspiring.
Yeah.
They didn't keep their experience to themselves. They went out and shared it with everyone who would listen.
Right.
And in doing so, they created a ripple effect, spreading the good news of Jesus' birth throughout their community.
It's like those ripples in a pond.
Yeah.
One small action can create a wave of impact that spreads far and wide.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to think about the context of the shepherd's story. They were just ordinary guys tending their sheep, probably thinking about anything but the coming of the Messiah.
Right.
And then bam, an angel appears.
Yeah.
And their whole world is turned upside down.
It's such a powerful reminder that God can show up in the most unexpected ways.
Yeah.
In the midst of our ordinary routines. And when he does, it's up to us to respond, to listen attentively, to act courageously, and to share boldly the hope we found.
And that's the message I'm taking away from this deep dive into Dan's sermon.
Yeah.
It's a call to wake up, to be present, to pay attention to the ways God is speaking to us.
Right.
And to be willing to step out in faith, even when it feels scary or uncertain.
Beautifully said. And as we wrap up our conversation, I can't help but think about the power of storytelling. Yeah. The shepherd's story, passed down through generations, continues to captivate and inspire us today.
It really does. And it reminds us that our own stories, our own encounters with God, have the power to impact others as well.
So let's not keep those stories to ourselves. Let's share them with boldness and compassion, inviting others into the incredible adventure of following Jesus.
That's a great challenge.
Yeah.
And for those of you who want to hear the full sermon and be inspired by Dan's message, you can find it on Flame Community Church's website, Facebook or YouTube channel.
It's definitely worth a listen.
And be sure to join us next week for another deep dive.
Yes.
As we explore more insights from the Word.
We'll be unpacking another powerful message that will challenge and encourage you on your journey of faith.
Until then, God bless and see you next week.